Hi all, our instructive game today will have the theme of dark square strangulation. So to demonstrate this theme, I'm choosing the game Anatoly Karpov vs Judit Polgar, played in the Linares 1994 tournament. Karpov playing white kicked off with e4, and Judit Polgar played the Sicilian defence. Now Karpov played c3, so avoiding the main line variations. Judit transposed now to a French defence, or trying to, by playing e6 and after d4 playing d5. So if Karpov played e5, that would be the advanced variation of the French. But instead, Karpov exchanges on d5 and plays knight f3. And now, potentially, he always has the threat of d takes c5, giving white the isolated d pawn. So Judit played knight c6, and after bishop b5, Judit decided to do something about white's luxury option of d takes c5. She did something quite radical. She played c4. So it avoids the bishop coming back to e2, but it's also prompting white to give up the bishop for knight soon. One drawback of this c4 move is that it can be undermined quite easily with b3, as we'll see later. First, Karpov plays knight e5, giving black immediate tactical threats to deal with. So how does Judit defend against this knight on c6? He actually played queen b6. Karpov voluntarily now gives up the light squared bishop. After b takes, we'll see structurally, black has this isolated pawn and the double pawns. But how are these weaknesses going to be exploited by Karpov? After castles, bishop d6, now Karpov undermines that c4 pawn, so voluntarily dissolving black's double pawns. So why would he want to do that? He gains some dynamic compensation immediately, because after c takes, a takes, white now has this blasting rook on the a file. So this weakness on a7 is now becoming less of an academic weakness, but a practical weakness to attack. After knight e7, Karpov now exchanges off, or tries to exchange off, black's dark squared bishop. So in doing this, this c5 square can later perhaps be occupied by white. So this is part now of the dark square strangulation strategy, which is the theme of the game. First is to exchange off these bishops. Judit Polgar now plays bishop takes e5, so she doesn't want to take on a3, so she leaves that potentially menacing bishop on that diagonal. On the other hand, that knight was also quite dangerous, so after d takes, she now blockades white's e pawn. Here though, Karpov plays queen d4, so Karpov doesn't mind queen takes b3, because then there would follow bishop takes e7 and queen c5 check, and white would be better. So Judit now plays knight f5, and the white queen goes to c5. So Judit's in a difficult position already. She can't easily castle, and potentially she doesn't want to lose this good piece on f5. So she actually secures the knight now on f5 by playing h5. So what does Karpov do now to increase the pressure? That's the question. He plays knight d2, and now Judit solves, or tries to solve, one of the problems of this king in the centre. She plays f6. So the king can come to f7, and also potentially Judit has some rosy prospects on the g file. So after ef, gf, is Karpov worried by this potential g file pressure? He had it all under control in this game, and it's instructive to see how. First he plays bishop b4, so he's still with the idea of attacking this a pawn. He's potentially doubling up rooks on this a file. Judit plays king f7, so she's at least connected her rooks, and potentially can play rook g8 to start targeting the white king in some variations. Karpov plays rook a4. Now with rook a4, there's positional aggression of doubling up rooks, but potentially the rook can also help on the king side and maybe come to f4 later. So here, Judit decided to exchange off queens. After bishop takes c5, she plays a6. And now, Karpov makes this attack look harmless. He plays actually f3. So one of the ideas of f3 is to be able to play king f2 and defend, if necessary, this g pawn with rook g1. So after h4, he plays rook fa1, so immediately intensifying pressure on this poor a pawn. After bishop c8, he plays now king f2. So he's not only able to defend the g-pawn now with rook g1s, but also he's able to contest the e-file if necessary with rook e1. So the king coming to the centre makes it quite safe, and also able to use the rooks more flexibly. After rook b8, Karpov now seals these dark squares with b4. So this dark square strangulation continues. After rook e8, Karpov now has magnificent knight. He uses it with knight b3. So all of a sudden there's threats now of knight a5, of knight d4. Potentially there's also the idea of g4. So if hg, hg, and now g4 next would evict this quite nice piece on f5. Judit resorts now to defending against some of these issues with these fixed light square pawns by playing bishop b7. So she voluntarily gives herself a terrible bishop. After knight a5, she plays bishop a8. So this is a 26-30 at the time. Judit Polgar, arguably one of the strongest of the Polgar sisters, with an absolutely terrible bishop on a8. Karpov is really strangulating the dark squares with this dark squared bishop. But how will he intensify the pressure now if black's solidly defending? First, actually, he plays rook 4 to a2. So he's securing his position a bit more, wondering what black will do here. Judit plays rook e6. And now Karpov plays bishop a7. So that's quite an annoying move. Why is it played just to move that rook off b8? Well, let's see. If the rook had just gone to, say, e8, let's have a look. What Karpov could have done here is knight b3 with the idea of knight c5, and also unleashing an attack immediately on the a pawn. So if the a pawn was trying to be defended with bishop b7, then knight c5. So the a pawn's actually gone here. Let's see the continuation though with Rybka. So this kind of continuation, white winning the a pawn, black would get temporary counterplay, but white is a solid pawn up here with a clear advantage. So let's go back. After bishop a7, black doesn't have too many choices. Judit played quite a controversial move now, perhaps a bad move, rook to b5. And here this rook is also a tactical target. Karpov retreats the knight to b3. And there's all sorts of threats now, like knight d4 still, especially if this knight can be evicted. And it's this knight being evicted which is the focus now of white's plan. After bishop b7, Karpov plays g4. So he wants to be able to play knight d4, and that would be forking these rooks. After hg, hg, Karpov saw these rooks were vulnerable and retreated this rook to e8. But there's another vulnerability in the position. After g4, knight d6, Karpov now has knight d4, just simply winning the exchange. The rook has nowhere to go. So this dark square strangulation has culminated in winning the exchange for nothing. Here Judit Polgar resigned. Let's have a look in overview and summary at this game. So Karpov avoided the mainstream Sicilian defence variations and instead played an ultra-positional game, strangulating black on the dark squares by first giving up the two bishops, undermining c4. So he created pressure on the a file, particularly the a7 pawn. He now exchanged off the dark squared bishops, but actually Judit took on e5 instead, leaving this potentially dangerous bishop on this diagonal. And now we see a plan of further intensifying the dark square pressure. Judit tries to gain some counterplay on the king side, as well as give her king an escape square. So potentially she had a dangerous looking G line, but nothing happened with this, especially after the exchange with queens. Karpov was able to just bring his king to f2, where it flexibly supported rook g1s and rook e1s. So black's counterplay was really minimal here. After rook b8, Karpov sealed the dark squares with b4. So rook e8, knight b3, and the knight had horrible threats now of knight a5 and knight d4 in some variations, as well as white retaining the possibility of g4, which was also enabled with the king f2 to be able to recapture with the h-pawn. So after bishop b7, Judit now had an awful looking bishop, but Karpov masterfully increased the pressure, first with this tactical threat, a simple tactical threat coming up of bishop a7. So the bishop coming to a7 from c5 means that the c5 square can be used by the knight, so to potentially harass this a pawn even more if necessary. But here Karpov played knight b3, and after bishop b7 tried to do something about black's best piece, so removing that knight on f5 by first playing g4 and h3, now threatening g4. So black's best piece is challenged. So black's pieces are becoming worse and worse, and after rook e8, Karpov, after g4, knight d6, simply won the exchange with knight d4, and Judit Polgar had had enough. She really didn't have much counterplay in this game, and it was a great demonstration really of dark square strangulation. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.